Thank you, and glad to be here. Let's take a look at what we're going to talk about. Immune defense. I think this is like the topic of our times, and for a lot of obvious reasons. And we have a moment where I don't think we've ever, any of us alive, ever experienced this, where the entire planet population is focused on one health problem, and it centers around how strong is our immune function. And I don't think this is just going to go away, right? This is going to be, with us for a generation, probably, in terms of the effect that the current pandemic is having on our psyche, not in terms of the actual virus, but in terms of the effect it's having on the psyche and how people are thinking about what the immune system means and how the immune system works. And nowhere is that more relevant than when we're looking at the gut. And so I thought today I could talk about 3 different really clear ways that immune defense is directly related to our microbiome and how we can protect ourselves and strengthen our immune system by strengthening our microbiome itself in the gut function. Okay, so the way that I was trained in 27 years ago was that GI health is really immune health. There wasn't sort of a separation in the naturopaths that trained me between those 2 subject areas. And we sort of understood, if we're talking about GI, we're talking about immune. And I mean, the evidence scientifically is just kind of stacked up in the last decades to sort of support that position that the naturopaths have maintained for, a couple thousand years. So the strange part about this really is quite almost surreal, is that your gut bacteria have this command and control role over your immune system. And I don't know it's almost kind of creepy when you learn about it. It's like, really? Is that seriously going on? Out of my control completely? Yeah. And then the next thing we want to talk about is that the digestion problems lead to absorption problems, lead to amino acid deficiencies, and that we need these amino acids desperately for a lot of different immune functions, including the production of antibodies. We'll talk a lot about how that can work. And then also this idea that stress physiology matters, and that when we're stressed and we're catabolic, one of the things that happens, so the premise of stress physiology, right, is that we're not in our normal metabolic flow, and we're using amino acids for fuel. And of course, we're going to burn through muscle tissue and be catabolic in that way. But also, we're going to be using up very conveniently the glutamine that's in the gut lining and burning that for energy and fuel. And so we see also with the stress response, secretory IgA and mucosal immunity being tied together with the stress response. So those 3 areas, right? What's happening with the microbiome, what's happening with amino acids, and what's happening with the stress response kind of link this or make this connection between the gut function and immune function. And the funny part about this is that if you just go online and start, and I've been doing this more and more in the last couple of years, just read all the research studies coming out. There's just more research than you can keep track of on how the depletion of gut microorganisms contributes to all kinds of different severe diseases. And you even start to see now the term dysbiosis being used widely by conventional researchers and conventional physicians. That's really kind of a stellar moment to see that. And there's nowhere more important than in our current moment in time. So I want to start off looking at the first main point on amino acids, okay? Then we'll get into secretory IgA and then talk about commensal bacteria. So here's point 1. And this is the hardest thing, has been the hardest thing for me to learn. And I want to dwell on this first point for quite some time. Amino acids and the role they play in the gut, okay? So where we're talking about is the stomach and then the intestinal tract lining, and how the ability of this system to absorb nutrients is really what we're dependent on for our survival. And that when we're stressed and the gut lining is broken down, automatically going to have problems. Number 1 stresses for most of the patients I work with would be emotional stresses, loss of a loved one, divorce, having a bunch of kids, being overworked, etc. And that we want to also look at this bigger picture and make sure that we're treating other body systems, right? Not just the gut. So just kind of thinking about that and making sure that we're addressing the emotional and spiritual aspects of disease as one of the main reasons why people get sick in the first place. And that if we're stressed and we're emotionally and spiritually disconnected, that's going to have a direct impact on our secretory IgA and our gut function and our gut immunity and all that too. And so it's not just about the sciencey stuff that we're going to talk about. There's also this other reason why people come to see us, and I think primarily for the emotional and spiritual reconnection that we can offer them. Okay. Now, there's a couple of different ways, though, on a more technical sciencey kind of level, that gut immunity and chronic stress and can kind of conspire to start to deplete amino acids. And I thought I would just use this one example as like a through line. There's probably literally 20 different versions of this we could go through with each of the 20 amino acids, right? But let's just talk about this one, because it's an easy one. And you could imagine extending this out to the other amino acids if you really want to get a little more interested in this kind of work. So one, obvious thing, chronic stress, catabolic physiology, deplete amino acids. We all know that, right? Including the burning up or using up of the gut lining because you're stressed and you're using the gut lining for fuel, using these amino acids for fuel. And so people end up becoming deficient in glutamine. Okay, so that's going to obviously impact the gut lining. That's going to cause all kinds of inflammatory responses and all kinds of things go on with cortisol. Your secretory IgA starts to drop. So your immune system is automatically compromised in this process, right? Weakening of the secretory IgA or mucosal immunity and weakening of the actual structure and function of the gut lining. Okay, I'm assuming that we all take that for granted. What's even more interesting is what happens next, okay? And this is news to me. Like, this is something I've just learned in the last couple of years. I think it's one of the most, if not the most important thing I've ever learned. So I want to talk about it. If you guys are, probably haven't really thought about it this way, because it's kind of a weird way to think about it. So this is just straight biochemistry right out of what we all learned in school. This is not anything unusual. It's not even an alternative or integrated medicine idea. We're just talking straight human physiology here. The basic facts are that if you have even a single amino acid that's deficient, now we're using glutamine just as an example. If you have a single amino acid out of the 20 amino acids from which you make protein that's deficient, it has body-wide effects across the whole system from your head to your feet. And that's why GI problems cause so many issues. Okay, another way of saying that is if you don't have enough hydrochloric acid, if you have an H. pylori infection, or you have a Giardia infection, if you can't break down protein, you're not chewing well, you're not eating healthy proteins, whatever it may be, if you're in a stress and catabolic physiology situation, any of these things that start to interfere with amino acid balance, which is extremely common, all the people that we're talking about that we do these GI tests on have some version of this, almost all of them, right? Then that's going to start to interfere with all kinds of other things. Like what? Like antibody production, like insulin production, like hemoglobin production, all because the gut's not working right. And so this is another way of thinking about it. This is basically looking at how the body makes proteins and how important that is, and how you cannot assemble proteins if you're missing even one of the 20 amino acids. Okay, there's no slack in the system. There's no other plan. One amino acid missing, you can't assemble proteins. And that's just human physiology 101. How do we do this? This takes us back to school, where you can see the primary structure at the top of the diagram there. Quite interesting. It's just a string of amino acids. We're making a protein. String together a couple hundred of those, and all of a sudden they start to do these interesting little things. They turn themselves into these twisty little ribbony things called alpha helixes. They also make these beta sheets. And this is all based on which amino acids are in which order, right? That the DNA or your body is assembling. And then what the charges are on the amino acids, how they attract and repel one another. Eventually you end up with these tertiary structures. And then finally, the final structure, which is just a string of amino acids pulled together that your body has then assembled. And then they make these things, right? And if one amino acid out of the 20 amino acids that you need to make every protein is missing, this can't happen properly. And you're going to have problems with protein folding, right? You're going to have something that's out of sequence. The charges aren't going to be right, and the assembly and structure of the protein is not going to work. And so here, and this is like another one of these facts that's just so mind-blowing, you don't even know what to say about it. All human proteins, not some, all human proteins have approximately the same amino acid composition. Okay, think about that again for a minute. Let me say that one more time. If it's an antibody, that's a protein. If it's an insulin molecule, that's a protein. If it's a hemoglobin molecule, that's a protein. If it's an enzyme, that's a protein. If it's anything that's a protein, this is like the whole human body has almost identical composition of each one of the amino acids, right? And these are the 20 listed here. And the one that has the smallest percentage, the smallest representation in every protein is tryptophan. That's why it's at the bottom of the list. Okay, and the one that's the largest you can see in these non-membrane proteins is methionine. But you get the idea, right? Every human protein has almost identical percentages of amino acids. What's different about each protein that makes, a heart-related protein separate from a bone-related protein is the way that they're strung together, the order, the sequence, but not the actual amount. So that means if you have one low amino acid, and we're using this example of glutamine, could use tryptophan all the same, right? If you could be emotionally stressed, burn through a lot of serotonin, be low in tryptophan, the same thing would happen. We're talking about gut today. So low glutamine alone, forget about the gut lining. You can live with leaky gut. Every patient that I saw today has a leaky gut, and they're all still alive, okay? That doesn't kill you necessarily. It makes you miserable and chronically ill, but it doesn't kill you. If glutamine levels are low, forget about the leaky gut for a minute. That's going to trigger problems with you being able to assemble proteins. Which proteins? All proteins in the human body except for collagen. Every single protein. Why? Because again, back to school here, the old days when we were learning this, like high school or college, whenever you learn this stuff, DNA is transcribed to RNA. You have these mRNA things going on, transfer RNA, but eventually you end up making a protein, okay, from these amino acids. That's really the goal here, the role. And what are these proteins? Again, if you're missing glutamine because you have a gut problem, forget about the leaky gut for a minute. We already know about that. We're saying you're also not going to be able to assemble immunoglobulins really well because they're proteins. If you don't have all 20 amino acids, you're going to be compromised with your immune function that way. You're not going to be able to make IgG. That's also made out of amino acids. You're not going to be able to make hemoglobin. That's a storage protein. It's made from amino acids. If you're missing just the glutamine, if your glutamine levels are frankly low, you're not going to be able to fully assemble all the proteins like hemoglobin. So you might have a problem with fatigue related to oxygen carrying capacity problems. You could have a problem with insulin that's related to your gut. You've burned up and used up the glutamine because of stress. You've burned up and used up the glutamine because you have a gut problem. And now, because you're missing one of the 20 amino acids, you can't make insulin effectively. So your blood sugar is whacked out. And this is why all these years, and every naturopath, functional medicine doctor knows this inside and out, you fix someone's gut and you're like, wow, that's kind of weird. Your blood sugar is better and you lost a lot of weight, or your sex drive is back and your hormones are doing better, or your toenail fungus is gone, or whatever of these little miracles we see every day in practice from fixing the gut. Part of it's related to this global problem that gut issues cause with proteins. Which proteins? All proteins in the human body. Just missing glutamine will interfere with the production of all these proteins, okay? That seems pretty important to me, so I'm going to dwell on that for a minute and just kind of take that in and let that resonate for a sec, okay? So in other words, if you have a chronic gut problem and there's a glutamine deficiency because of stress, physiology, because you have a bunch of infections or SIBO or something's wrong with your gut, that's going to have a global effect on your body's ability to absorb amino acids. That's going to affect your DNA's capacity to assemble proteins. One missing amino acid means you can't make proteins properly. Proteins don't fold right. Your body's still going to attempt to make them. They're just not going to be as happy and functional proteins as they would be otherwise, right? So point number 2, secretory IgA and the role it plays in the stress response. And this is straight up gut mucosal health, right? Just mucosal tissue function 101. So when we're stressed, and cortisol is out of balance. Cortisol helps modulate secretory IgA. So the more stressed you are, the more potentially messed up your mucosal immunity gets, right? And a lot of that mucosal immune system, the mucosal tissue, obviously is your gut lining, mouth and throat and stomach and intestinal tract, small intestine, large intestine, right? It's all mucosal tissue. And so secretory IgA, when we're stressed, gets thrown out of whack and our mucosal defense starts to suffer. And that's that first line barrier defense that's in the mucosal tissue that keeps out viruses, bacteria, parasites, keeps the yeast under control and all that. So stress-induced problems, inflammatory problems are going to be impacted, are going to impact secretory IgA. And you'll see secretory IgA problems in most of your chronic gut patients, and you'll see the ability, or you'll have the ability to help correct mucosal immunity and help correct secretory IgA issues if you learn how to fix gut problems by running gut tests, okay? And there's all kinds of issues around mucosal immunity and viral infections that are probably more relevant today than ever. You can read about that if you want. I think it's pretty interesting. This little study I pulled up here from 2001, it's got the mucosal surfaces are the first portals of entry for most infectious agents, right? Among which respiratory and intestinal viruses are of greatest importance. So, for me in my practice, it's usually been infections like Giardia or Crypto or Blasto or yeast overgrowth in the intestinal tract or H. pylori in the stomach, right? And those are going to flare up and cause people problems as their secretory IgA weakens. So you get a weakening of the mucosal immunity. Maybe you've had a Giardia infection since you were a kid. Now you're 37, you just had your first baby, and all of a sudden you're having a lot of problems because your mucosal immunity is a little weak because you haven't slept in a year because you have a new baby, and then the Giardia flares up. So when you're looking at mucosal immunity and gut infections, you want to think, number one, is the immune system really strong? In which case, hey, maybe that Giardia is just sitting there, it's not causing a big problem. And then number two, the mucosal immunity is weak because of stress, secretory IgA levels are compromised, and then that infection that's been there for a long time starts to flare up and cause symptoms. So we obviously see a lot of people get sick when they're under stress. And you can, if you want to kind of stay up with the times, you can read about the role of mucosal immunity specifically with different viruses. That's not a big part of my practice, but it's just something that I think is timely and you should know about so you can have good discussions with your patients. But the idea here being that secretory IgA and the intensity of the immune response in the mucosal surfaces really determines how well our gut immunity is going to work and regulates to a large extent the entire immune system in a really profound way. Okay, so that's point number two. And then point number three, this is the creepy kind of surreal and weird part of the gut, is that the commensal bacteria play a role in gut mucosal barrier health and immunity. I just wanted to look at a little bit of these. There's, I think on the GI 360, I think they measure like 54 of them. The doctors can correct me later if I'm wrong about that. But they measure, I think, over 50 of these commensals, and they all do different and complicated things. I've studied them for the last 4 or 5 years. I know very little about them, to be honest, because it's a really complicated subject. Even if you spend, a couple hundred hours looking at this stuff, you just go like, whoa, this is like, it's a career. It's like a PhD track kind of career. But, we need to know a little bit about the microbiome, at least so we can speak intelligently about it and be able to look at the labs and analyze them and make sense of the lab tests. So one of the sort of most important things here is that mucin layer or mucosal layer. And here it's depicted. You can see there's an outer mucus layer and an inner mucus layer. And what we're talking about is that the thickness of that mucus layer, or that mucin, is a critical component in maintaining the health of your microbiome and the health and functioning of your immune system. And you can see down here on the right-hand column, it says biochemical barrier, physical barrier, right? Those are the actual intestinal cells, and then immunological barrier, all right? And so there is a constant feedback and talking and back and forth going between the gut bacteria that are outside hanging around in the intestinal tract and the immune cells that lay right beneath the surface in this diagram. And the creepy and strange part is that to a very significant extent, those intestinal bacteria that are not us, right? They're these whole separate organisms living their own little happy bacterial lives. They have direct regulatory control over large aspects of our immune system. You wouldn't think it would work this way, but it does. And one example is called B. fragilis, and its relationship to something called PSA. Okay, so you can see here the B. fragilis in the upper right-hand corner with PSA. That PSA comes from B. fragilis, right? It creeps its way down across your intestinal lining cells and gets into your bloodstream, your system, your body, and starts to regulate immune cells. It literally is telling you that bacteria is not impacting and not influencing. It's directly telling your immune cells exactly what they should and shouldn't do. And if you don't have enough B. fragilis present, that process doesn't work that very well, right? So our immune cells are reliant upon instructions from these bacteria that are growing in our gut. It seems like a pretty high risk situation to me to trust these gut bacteria to tell our immune systems what to do. But no one asked me about whether this was a good plan or not. So just another way of saying this is that if you don't have the right amount of B. fragilis, and you don't make the right amount of PSA, then your internal regulation of your own immune system is not going to work very well. In other words, we are dependent on these bacteria to tell our immune system what to do. And it's too late. You can't just change your mind and say, oh, I don't really believe in that or want that to happen in my body. I'm going to make that different. It's too late now. This is how the system's been set up, right? So you have to just deal with the fact that if your microbiome is compromised, your own regulation of your immune system is not going to be where it should be. Okay, and there's also a lot of research that's been done around the area of allergies and how commensal bacteria help regulate immune function in relation to allergies as well. And you work with a lot of food allergies. I'm sure you're aware of that too. That's another thing to think about. And there's article after article here on B. fragilis and how it relates to functioning of the immune system. I'll just read a couple lines from this one. But bacterial colonization of the intestine is critical for the normal function of the mammalian, that's us, immune system. Okay. And this was, I think, is one of the more interesting aspects, is that, however, the specific molecules produced by commensal bacteria that contribute to the modulation of host immune system are largely uncharacterized. PSA, polysaccharide A, produced by the ubiquitous human commensal B. fragilis, is a model symbiosis factor. PSA is capable of stimulating, activating T-cell dependent immune responses that can affect both the development and balance or homeostasis of the host immune system. Okay, so what they're saying here is that this picture here, B. fragilis makes PSA, and that regulates the immune cells directly below there in the diagram. Your immune cells are taking instructions from this bug, okay, through this mechanism called PSA. So, and there, if you go through each of the different commensal bacteria, you'll see all kinds of different ramifications. I'm just trying to pull up one example so you can sort of have some talking points with patients and be able to speak intelligently. I know, I feel confident talking about maybe 6 or 8 of these organisms after a couple of years of study. I don't think you need to be conversant in all 50 plus. If you pick on the most important ones, I think B. fragilis is right up there. Akkermansia is probably one that we all should know. Deep Hydra, let's see, E. coli, kind of know that, gotta know that one, right? So there's maybe, 10 or 12 of these that you really should have some spiel memorized for and know the basic mechanisms for. And that's enough to get started and to be able to interpret the lab and be able to sit down and have an intelligent conversation with the patient about your Akkermansia is off and what you think that means, or your B. fragilis is off and how that affects your immune system. And I don't think it's realistic for us to, memorize and understand how all 50 of these organisms interact. It's just too much for most clinicians to hold in their head, certainly too much for me to memorize. But 5 or 10 of these organisms you should study, and I think you'll be able to have really great conversations with people about that. Okay. And then the effects go on in terms of how the commensal bacteria regulate immune system function. There's, again, more studies than we could probably read about this subject area, okay? And so just a quick summary here. I'm gonna show you some labs, and we'll have time for questions. But the quick summary is, number 1, amino acids really matter. If you're deficient in like a single amino acid like glutamine, Remember, let's say you're stressed and your gut lining's not well and you've got a leaky gut and the person's quite low in glutamine because of all that. That glutamine deficiency is going to have an impact not just on the gut lining, but on the entire body in the assembly of proteins, because missing one of the 20 amino acids means you can't assemble proteins. Which proteins? All proteins in the human body except for collagen. Just think about other aspects of low glutamine that are so important. That's how we make our glutathione. You can't make glutathione unless you have glycine, cysteine, and glutamine. So another effect of low glutamine because of chronic gut problems, you can't make glutathione. That's the most important antioxidant in the body. That's what's protecting us from, all the ravages of oxidative stress. So once you get into this amino acid deficiency thing that comes about because of gut problems, you start to see it has body-wide effects. And I think the most important message that I've gotten recently, and I was taught this, but I didn't believe it until I saw it a couple thousand times, is that these kinds of gut problems that we're talking about most of the time manifest in non-GI symptoms, So you might have somebody who's struggling to make enzymes that relate to their blood sugar, and they have blood sugar handling problems and sugar cravings, and maybe they're even pre-diabetic or diabetic. And that comes back to their gut not being able to absorb amino acids and make the enzymes properly. So we're going to see non-GI related symptoms in these patients that have chronic gut problems. That's the most important thing, so whether they're immune related or not. Second point is secretory IgA and the role it plays in stress response, gut health, and gut mucosal immunity, right? So this is the integrity of the mucosal barrier is under the control of secretory IgA. And when that mucosal barrier is weak, the immune system is down in the gut lining, then that's going to affect all the mucosal tissues throughout the body, the respiratory tract, the vaginal tract, sinus passageways. They're all going to be impacted. When SIG-A is off in one part of the body, it's off throughout the body. And so people end up with potential for easily picking up infections in all kinds of tissues of the body. And then the third point is that the commensal bacteria, like B. fragilis, have a direct role in telling our immune cells what to do. Okay, so if you can strengthen the microbiome, you can in the gut lining, and you can do these gut tests in gut patients and non-GI patients as well, you can be able to improve immune function and all these different, through all these different mechanisms, right? It's pretty straightforward. All right, so let's look at some labs so you can just see how easy this can be. All right, so here's a test. Excuse me. All right. And let's look at the hard part first, and we'll come back to the easy part. The hard part is this, is understanding what each one of these mean. Here's our B. fragilis, you see that on the left-hand side? So like, again, you don't have to memorize all these, but memorize at least 5 or 6, so you have something to talk about basically in a consult. And some of these I can't even pronounce. I can't even pronounce that one. Bacterium mitsuokai. Okay, I don't know anything about that one. So don't feel intimidated, but just get yourself educated on some of these so you can have, intelligent discussions with patients. And you can mention a few of these names and have a general sense of what this whole portion of the lab means. Okay, and after 3 or 4 years of focusing on this, I feel like I can have a comfortable conversation about this portion of the lab, which is important. So your patients feel like you know what you're doing. Now, doctor's data makes this really easy for us, okay? I'm just scrolling through that to kind of intimidate you. But, really, it's all right up here. All you really have to do, once you've memorized your 5 or 6 organisms, is look up in the summary section and see what the dysbiosis index is. That tells you whether you need to treat or not, right? And so if it's in the yellow, or even worse, if it's in the red, then you have a problem with dysbiosis and you're going to want to do something. And you have, like several levels of choice. I think of it as 3 levels of intervention. The first level being helping the microbiome itself directly with prebiotics and probiotics and fiber. And these days, a lot of the supplement companies we work with have butyrate, which is amazing. So you have prebiotics, probiotics, fiber, or butyrate as like the first line of defense to do GI program. And then the next level of treatment up from that is working with the GI organs themselves. If the person needs gallbladder help, if they need some gut repair, if they want, they need hydrochloric acid for their stomach or pancreatic enzymes. So you're helping the organs work better in the GI tract. And then the third level I think of is eliminating or killing pathogens. So 3 levels again: treating the microbiome, prebiotics, probiotics, fiber, butyrate. Second level, treating the organs themselves, ox bile for the bladder, pancreatic enzymes for the pancreas, HCl for the stomach, leaky gut repair stuff for the damaged gut lining, anti-inflammatories for healing the gut. So you're dealing with the organs themselves. And then the third level is killing stuff. In this case, blastocystis is observed, elastase is low, and secretory IgA is very low. So that's everything you really need to know right there. Okay, and one of these bacterial markers is high. So this person has a parasitic infection called blastocystis that you're going to, well, probably want to kill, right, eliminate. They have some dysbiosis you may need to treat later. They need some pancreatic enzymes, and they need their secretory IgA to start to come up. So you got to address the stress response, emotional stuff, spiritual stuff to help with the SIG-A, because cortisol is really, in the mix with that one, right? And then you also want to do pancreatic enzymes and an antimicrobial program to get rid of the blasto. So that's pretty straightforward. Again, like 3 levels of treatment. And now here's the kicker. And I've had probably 3 blasto treat patients in the last month. Ready for this? I'm going to say this again. I've had 3 blasto patients in the last month. None of them have had GI symptoms. I'm going to say this again. I've had at least 3 blasto patients in the last couple of months. None of them have had GI symptoms. Then what's going on, right? Like, why did I even do the GI test? Well, because in my clinic, you have to do a GI test just to become a patient. It's not an optional thing. There's no discussion around that. And I got this from Dr. Bill Timmons, 1995. Bill came into the office and he just convinced me that I needed to do GI tests on who? On everybody. On people that had GI symptoms? No, everybody. And in Dr. Timmons' practice, you literally couldn't talk to him, literally couldn't even walk into his clinic and speak with him until you had done a GI test. It didn't matter if you had hormone imbalances, chronic fatigue, didn't matter if you were a kid or an older adult, didn't matter if you were pregnant or not pregnant, didn't matter if you wanted to play tennis better or you wanted to get over your autoimmune disease. You had to do a GI test before you could talk to him. There was not even a discussion. There was no place you could discuss that with him because you literally had to perform that test before you could go in and do your new patient consult. So when I grew up under that naturopath's, tutelage, mentorship, I was like, oh, okay, this is how people do it. And so you're going to find blastocystis in all kinds of patients that don't have any GI symptoms at all. What might they have? They might have an amino acid deficiency problem that's related to enzymes that relate to blood sugar. They could have an immune problem, right? That's related to antibody production or to the SIG-A. So we want to kind of try to free ourselves of this idea that the GI testing is for GI patients. It's not. It's for every patient. That is the fundamental concept of functional medicine that, in my mind, Dr. Timmons grilled into me. You do a GI test on everybody. Does it matter what they have? No. It's just the prerequisite for entering the clinic. Okay, here's another sample test. So again, dysbiosis score around 3, not bad, but not great. And then we look at the summary findings here. So they've got some problem with candida overgrowth, again, low elastase, low SIG-A, and a bunch of problems on the commensal side, right, with Clostridia. And again, you're looking at the lab. It's pretty intimidating to even be able to pronounce all these names here, but the summary on the report, beginning of the report, kind of gives you the basics that you need. I'll tell you the ones that are my personal favorites, and this is not to brainwash you into doing it this way, but I love the B. fragilis. I love Akkermansia. I don't know, I think it sounds really cool. Plus, that's a really important organism. D. piger, I like a lot. E. coli seems like you just kind of got to learn about E. coli, for better or worse. M. smithii is my other commensal that I like a lot, that I talk to patients about. And of course, lactobacillus and bifidobacter so there's, I don't know, 6 right there probably, okay? And then looking through the test again, we're looking for the bacterial overgrowth problems, parasites, etc. And this person didn't have any of that. Let's see. Oh, and then with that case, of course, you treat the candida, right? Whether or not they have a gut-related problem. You still want to clear that up. Another dysbiosis index here of 3. And this person has overgrowth or high levels of some of the commensals, Firmicutes, Bacteroides fragilis, etc., right? Faecalibacterium prausnitzii, that's another one of my top 10. That guy's really interesting. That's low. You should read about that one. That's an interesting bug, okay? And again, if it's low on the test and you know about 5 or 10 of these organisms, you can talk about it for a few minutes with the patient and say, oh, Faecalibacterium prausnitzii is low. Let me tell you what that means. Just a minute or two on that. And people will calm down. They feel like you really know what's going on. Now, this particular patient has Dientamoeba fragilis and Entamoeba coli. So D. fragilis, pretty nasty parasite in my experience. Have to treat that, either antibiotics if it's appropriate, or an herbal antimicrobial program if that's more appropriate, depending on the patient. We had a 13-year-old girl in the clinic the other day, just got back from Guatemala. The family was living in Guatemala for 2 years, came back to the US. She had a D. fragilis, really sick kid. She went to her pediatrician, got it treated with medication. So it doesn't always have to be herbal programs, although that's kind of my preference, obviously. Elastase low. Now there's an organ system problem, right? So we talked about 3 levels of treatment. One is, or 3, the top level is killing the bad guys like D. fragilis and Entamoeba coli. The second level is dealing with organ systems to strengthen them. In this case, the pancreas with elastase being low, pancreatic enzymes. The butyrate being low, you can now again give butyrate, or you can give people fiber, prebiotics, and probiotics. So 3 levels of treatment. One is for the microbiome itself. In this case, you'd want to get the Faecalibacterium prausnitzii to come up. You'd want to get the butyrate to come up. You can use butyrate, fiber, prebiotics, or probiotics, right, for that level of microbiome treatment. Second level of treatment, the elastase is low. You can use pancreatic enzymes to help that organ. The other organs you can help would be gallbladder, stomach, intestinal tract itself. And then the third level of treatment which this patient needs is killing stuff. So sometimes all 3 levels of treatments are required in the same person, and you want to just stage that so that you can deal with each of these things sequentially. Maybe sometimes you try to do them all at the same time, but I try to not overwhelm people with too many products, okay? So again, learning about 5 or 6 of these organisms, maybe a few more, so you have some intelligent conversation points, and then understanding that we're going to do this GI test with every patient. Anyone that's worried about their immune system, first words out of my mouth are like, we got to check your microbiome. And they're like, why? Well, there's 3 reasons. If your microbiome's messed up, you might have amino acid problems, which means you can't make antibodies. That's an issue. Number 2, if your microbiome is messed up, we got to look at mucosal immunity and secretory IgA and strengthen your mucosal immunity so you're resistant against viruses, bacteria, parasites, and yeast. And number 3, we got to check your microbiome because some of these organisms like B. fragilis have direct control over your immune cells. And as creepy and weird as that sounds, we got to see friend or foe here, right? What's going on with these bugs and what are we going to do about it? Thank you, guys.